everybody, welcome to another episode of the GameSmith, where for about the last 20 videos we've been focusing on how to build scatter terrain. And in that time I've discovered 5 hacks that will allow you to build scatter terrain better, stronger, faster, and won't cost you $6 million. So in this video, we're going to discuss 5 different hacks that will improve your use of scatter terrain on your game table, whether you play tabletop role-playing games or whether you use them for war games or historical games. Really doesn't matter. Scatter terrain is scatter terrain. Now the first of these is going to be multi-use scatter terrain. Now what I mean by that is making sure that when you develop scatter terrain, that it has multiple uses. Now, a simple stone wall can be used in a variety of ways. Making a wall that is specifically made out of gold or bronze or has specific runes on it is a lot more specific. Similarly, what we might end up doing is we create a tree that looks really cool on the table, say one that has white bark and is covered with red leaves, which will immediately evoke imagery from any of George R.R. Martin's books. Or if the tree is silver and has red leaves, those of you familiar with Terry Brooks stories will be familiar with that particular tree. Now that might look really cool on your table, but it has a specific use to it. And running into a forest of white barked trees with red leaves might be really cool, but it could also create the wrong image for your table. Simply building a number of traditional trees will serve you much better in terms of scatter terrain. Now similarly, the same idea could apply to rock formations or any other scatter terrain. The idea here is that if I build a plain rock formation, I could use that whether it's in plains or swamp or mountains or hilly terrain or in a forest. I could use it in multiple locations. That's multi-use terrain. Whereas if I built crystal formations, chances are I'm only going to use those in a subterranean or a cave-like environment, or maybe on an alien world or something like that. It has much fewer options in the traditional frame of thinking. So in terms of the effort or resource output that you're using, you want to make sure that it has as many uses as possible. Now the next hack that I want to talk about is building scatter terrain in multiple scales. Now what I mean by that is traditionally most characters show up as 28mm miniatures. We call those medium-sized creatures. But we also run into large-sized creatures as well. Now it helps to be able to build terrain that will kind of trick the eye into working in both of these sizes as well. I also suggest that if you can build terrain that stretches the boundaries between large size creatures and huge size creatures, that works even better. Now traditionally what I've done is build scatter terrain that works with medium-sized creatures, and then built separate terrain that works with large-sized creatures. But what I discovered is this hack that where if I build terrain or scatter terrain that fits in between these, that's a little bit big to fit a 28mm or medium-sized creature, and it's a little on the small side to work with a large-sized creature, the mind will actually work with it on the game table, depending on the size of the miniature that I have next to it. Bookshelves are a great example of this. The bookshelves that I've created for my game table are slightly too large for a medium-sized creature and slightly too small for a large-sized creature. So I can convincingly use this scatter terrain equally at my game table, regardless of the 2 sizes that I'm using. Now obviously this strategy isn't going to work in every single environment or scenario that you're going to come up with. The idea here is to game the scatter terrain so that you can use it the most often. If you were playing an adventure path that dealt with giants, for example, like the Giant Slayer adventure path from Pathfinder, or the Storm King's Thunder from D&D, you're probably going to want to create scatter terrain that deals in scales that are going to be useful for giants, because you're going to be playing that adventure for quite some time, hopefully. TPK notwithstanding multiple times. Anyway, you're going to want to create terrain that you can use the most often. So if you create a terrain in that environment that is slightly smaller, you're going to probably be able to use it much longer. Now, it also bears mentioning in terms of multiple scales for scatter terrain, how I build the terrain, because I can get more utility out of how I build the terrain than just building a single use item. For example, I could build a house for medium-sized creatures. Works perfectly fine. However, anytime I go to put a large or a huge-sized creature in there, it's going to look really awkward and out of scale. However, if I built the house components, the walls, the doorway, out of different sized scatter terrain, then I could readjust the size of my pieces in order to accommodate a large and a huge size creature. So the overall outcome is how I build my multiple scale terrain actually can have an impact on how functional it is at the table. So the next terrain hack that I want to talk about is creating your terrain as generic as possible. Now, as uninteresting as that sounds, the idea here is you want to create as many different terrain types as possible by minimizing the amount of terrain you're actually creating. What I mean is that I want to create scatter terrain that is usable in as many different environments as possible without having to create any special features in the scatter terrain to make it usable in that environment. Now, in terms of multiple terrain types, it's a lot easier to add features through imagination than it is to take away. At least that's been my experience. I find it a lot easier to have generic rocks covering an open field and imagine that it is covered with snow than to have a snow-covered environment and ask my players to imagine that it's not covered with snow. I don't know why that is, but it just seems to be easier for people to add things to their theater of mind than it is to take away. Now, the exception to this idea would be if you know that you're going to be having an extended adventure or campaign or multiple adventures in a particular kind of environment that is outside that generic, then the new ubiquitous terrain would be the generic version, wouldn't it? So in the Pathfinder Adventure Path Reign of Winter, the vast majority of the adventure takes place in snowy, icy terrain. So as a consequence, you would want to build a lot of scatter terrain for that kind of environment. Now let's contrast that for a moment with an adventure path like Kingmaker, which actually takes place over multiple seasons across many years. So you would want to have a generic terrain that kind of fits all of the seasons, depending on how you organize your gameplay. Having a bit of snowy covered terrain would actually help the table set the mood for when you knew you were going to be in winter. Just the same as a few autumn colored trees sprinkled in amongst the green trees would set the tone for a very fall-like environment. Now, all of that can just be kind of wiped away if you just create a generic terrain and just remind your players, hey, it's fall or it's winter, and then you don't need to worry about it. This will help save resources. This will definitely help you save time in having to build a winter terrain, a spring terrain, a fall terrain, and a summer terrain. Now, there are some specialized terrains that can be used in multiple environments. For example, Fey terrain, which is kind of reality bending, doesn't look like conventional terrain. They look very alien. And as a consequence, if you were playing another game such as Starfinder or Star Wars or Traveler or some other game where you were using miniatures, you could use that terrain in those environments as well. Now, our fourth terrain hack is actually to build in bulk, or purchase in bulk, depending on what it is that you're doing. In either case, the traditional perception of scatter terrain, at least from my perspective, has been to have as little terrain on the play area as possible to actually represent a larger, more abundance of whatever that scatter terrain piece is. However, I've often found that having a few scatter terrain pieces will get the job done. Having an abundance of those scatter pieces makes the play space more interesting and in some cases more terrifying for the players. What I mean by that is you could have a few birch trees sitting on your game table and tell your players you're walking through a forest. Or you could have 5, 10, 15 of these trees sitting on your game surface, and now suddenly your players are concerned about where is the ambush coming from. I've found that stone walls is probably the best example of what I mean by this terrain hack. Building one wall will not serve you at the table unless that wall happens to be 3 feet long. And even then, it doesn't have a lot of utility because it's just a single long wall. Now if I build 8 or 10 6-inch sections of wall, now I have a large number of features that I can organize in a variety of ways in order to maximize their use of scatter terrain at my table. Now, I think that the best advice that I can give in terms of building in bulk is to create an assembly line for producing your scatter terrain. Now, in one of my videos that I worked on creating hedgerows and stone walls, I didn't just create one at a time, I actually created 10 at a time. I broke down each of those projects in terms of the steps that I wanted to use in order to build it, and then I went through each of those steps individually as I went. Now, this can be a little bit boring, but it also helps with something that we're going to talk about in the terrain hack number 5, which is to how you organize the building of your terrain. Now, our 5th terrain hack is to prioritize our builds. And what I mean by that is to plan ahead. Now, at the time I'm filming this, I actually have 3 Pathfinder adventure paths on the go, plus a homebrew adventure path for Pathfinder. I have a D&D adventure on the go, and a Starfinder campaign, and a DC Heroes 3rd Edition campaign on the go. Now, how I'm able to juggle all of that is the topic for a completely different video. Suffice to say that my crafter brain is working on terrain for all of these games at the same time. Now, obviously, if you're not running 5 or 6 games at a time, or participating in that many adventures, or producing terrain for that many adventures, you really don't need to worry about this. If this is, terrain building is a side project for you, this hack isn't really going to help you. But I know for a fact there are a lot of you out there that are just like me, that have a lot of things on the go, and your crafting brain is constantly working at how do I get something for the table ready in time. It all comes down to prioritizing. Now, in terms of prioritizing your building, it's very important to plan ahead. Particularly for me, when I have so many adventures on the go, and I have so much scatter terrain that I'm building on the go, and not just scatter, but big builds as well. So it becomes really important to prioritize the things that I need to get done next weekend versus 3 months from now. Now, obviously, not everybody is in that same kind of situation where you have a lot of adventures on the go. But maybe you have other things pulling on your time: family, job, friends, other commitments that are pulling on your time. And so prioritizing your build becomes a matter of time management, of where am I going to fit the time in to work on this. So knowing how long something takes to dry, for example, how long does the glue take to dry, how long does the paint take to dry, becomes important. So if I know that I have a block of time that I can work on something, but then once I glue these things together, I'm going to have to wait 6, 8, 10, 24 hours before I can work on this project again, I need to prioritize and organize where I'm going to work on that build so that other priorities that I have in my life can be dealt with while I'm waiting for that project to dry. Now for myself, I always have at least 3 builds on the go at any one time, and I specifically organize and prioritize my crafting that way so that while I'm working on Project 1, when I've reached a point where I need to worry about dry time and things like that, then I can start working on Project 2. And when Project 2 reaches a point where I need to worry about dry times, then I can work on Project 3. Now, typically what happens by that point is Project 1 is available to me, and when I've done with Project 3, I return to Project 1 and work on the next step. And at some point, one or more of those projects becomes completed, and I move it out of the queue and add another one. So my Project 2 becomes Project 1, my Project 3 becomes Project 2, and then I bring in a new Project 3. I'm sure I made that unnecessarily complicated, but chances are you're all gamers and are used to dealing with things that are unnecessarily complicated anyway. Now, also in relation to prioritizing your build deals with something that I refer to as the complexity of the build. Now, some things are really simple to make and that I can whip them out in a few hours, or depending on the dry times and such, I might have to do multiple sessions in order to get it done. But they're really simple projects. Now, complex builds require a lot more time, a lot more tinkering, and a lot more fidgeting. And I have to prioritize those in terms of the resources that I need to accumulate in order to work on those. So, things that require specialized tools, specialized pieces, a very long trip to Michael's, or I'm waiting on getting a coupon for something because there's some materials at the hardware store that I want to buy, but I know that there's going to be a flyer coming out next weekend, and maybe what I need will be on sale. So I'm trying to juggle all of these things in terms of what are the complexities of the pieces that I need in order to build them. And I factor that into my prioritizing my builds. I also think it's worth mentioning that you really don't need a lot of scattered terrain in order to set a mood at the game table. So if you find as though that you are unable to meet the needs or demands of all of the things that are pulling on your time and resources, don't feel bad. Being able to prioritize things other than gaming is really important too. Now, for those of you who stuck around until the end, I actually have a bonus terrain hack for you. And that bonus hack is to cluster your tiny terrain together. Now, what I mean by that is very often, at least at my game table, I have a lot of crates and barrels and small terrain pieces that are organized into large groups, and I have to place each individual barrel, each individual crate, and so on. Now, here's a simple way of clustering them all together, so you only have to do that once. Just a quick side note that the Deep Cuts Miniatures series by WizKids has the right idea. They've clustered their barrels together in order to make their placement on the table much easier. Now I have these miniature barrels which were actually made by a gamer out of some resin. I bought these 6 barrels for just a few dollars and then I painted them myself. You can actually see the little bubbles here left over from the molding process. Now, because all these barrels are separate from one another, anytime I want to place them on the table, I actually have to place each one individually. However, if I clustered my tiny terrain on a clear plastic sheet, the barrels could actually be added or removed from the table much easier. I'm going to use this plastic fruit container to serve as my base. And I'll just start by removing a large section of this plastic container in order to make it easier to use. We don't need a large section, and I don't want to waste the plastic either. I'll save as much of this container as I can, and I'll recycle the rest. I'll cluster the barrels to determine how much of the plastic I actually need in order to create a suitable base. Then I'll mark the size of the plastic I want, and I'll remove the rest. I suggest doing this as close to one of the edges as possible, so you can use the excess plastic for another project. Next, I want to make sure that all the barrels actually fit on the surface. Then all I need to do is glue the barrels on the base. However, I'll place them in a more interesting pattern than just a standing group of barrels. Now I'm going to use my trusty glue gun to attach these barrels, but feel free to use any glue that'll get the job done. Regardless of the glue that you choose, apply it sparingly so it doesn't squeeze out the bottom of the barrel and ruin the base. Now we have a cluster of tiny scatter terrain that we can easily place on any map, board, or battle mat.
Because our base is transparent, the play surface will show through. And now our tiny scattered terrain is a lot easier to add or remove from our play surface. And there's the bonus terrain hack. Cluster your tiny terrain.
I hope you all enjoyed the 5 terrain hacks and found them useful. If you like what we're doing here at the GameSmith, please hit that subscribe button. And if you've already done that, please hit that bell notification button so you'll always know when another video is coming out. If you liked what we did here today, please hit that thumbs up button. And I encourage you to go and check out our Facebook page, our Instagram, our Pinterest, and our website at thegamesmith.org. We have all kinds of cool stuff going on there that you might find interesting, not the least of which is my insane ramblings on my blog. So our next video is going to be episode 1 of series 2 here at the GameSmith, which deals with water. But don't worry, we won't be forgetting about scattered terrain. We'll be adding videos to this playlist as we move along, so you needn't worry about that. And there's something else I'm supposed to mention. What was it? Oh yeah. I'll see you at the table.